Hello, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Someone in the back?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks for coming. My name is Oona Robertson. Most of you know me. I'm an MFA student here at UNLV and a graduate assistant for the Black Mountain Institute. Tonight we're going to have a reading by Morgan Thomas. After that, there's going to be a short Q&A. There's a table in the lobby where you can buy a copy of their book, Manywhere, and they're going to be signing books after the reading. And then after that, there's an informal gathering at Segway, which is the second floor of the Beverly Theater. A couple upcoming events to know about. The first is a workshop taught by Morgan Thomas. It's on queer and trans ecologies. And there's still space in that, so you can email the Black Mountain Institute and they will give you the application. There's also a collaborative exhibition at the Rita Deanan Abbey Museum, which is on exhibit through October 29th. And it's really cool because a lot of the MFAs wrote poems to go along with the art pieces, so definitely check that out. And as usual, there's always so much going on. There's 2 more events this week alone, so go visit the website, blackmountaininsitute.org. I want to thank BMI's donors who make this event and every event possible: Miriam Shearing, Beverly Rogers, the Rogers Foundation, and the College of Liberal Arts at UNLV. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous peoples who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Moapa Band of Paiutes. Also, I forgot to say to silence your cell phones if you haven't done that. Morgan Thomas is a writer from the Gulf Coast. Their debut story collection, Manywhere, was published by MCD-FSG. Their work has appeared in the Atlantic, American short fiction, the Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. In Manywhere, realities are porous and overlapping. Time tumbles, and language itself takes off its clothes to reveal something more solid than whatever the reader was expecting. Morgan puts new words to what we know to be true, that mutability is the steadiest thing we have, that language can make tangible what history has disappeared from us, that we can use our stories to disarticulate who we have been told we are and write ourselves whole again. This book is one I wish I had read when I was young, one which, if it had been available to me, would have been a part of my becoming. I'm so glad it's made its way into this world. Please join me in welcoming Morgan Thomas.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Wonderful. I'm going to be reading 3 short pieces tonight. Before I get started, I am going to keep my mask on, and I know that can make it harder to hear and understand. So Jordan, who I can see right there, has some copies of what I'll be reading. If a visual representation would be helpful for you, you can just raise your hand and Jordan will bring you those now or at any point during the reading. Wonderful. Great, so I have 3 pieces. I am going to time myself and have timed it, and it is usually exactly like 21 minutes and 45 seconds. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I'm hoping for. And 2 weeks ago, when Edgar was reading, a participant asked the question, how can you tell if an animal is gay? And there's a way in which this entire reading is just an answer to that question, so here we go. This first excerpt is nonfiction. I grew up in the rural South in a conservative and sort of weirdly science-minded family, so while I didn't hear a lot about gay people, I heard a lot about gay animals. Male ibises ingesting mercury and being attracted to other male ibises, overcrowded rats that were suddenly uninterested in the nuclear family. And I held tightly to these crumbs of queerness, and this excerpt is about the first time I ever admitted to another person that I considered myself to be one of those queer animals. It's called A Note on the Apparent Lowering of Moral Standards in the Lepidoptera. Whiptail lizard. Come night, burrowed in the same hole, they curl beat to beat. When one smells of estrus, the other jaws her abdomen, her neck, wrings her, touching cloaca to cloaca. No gametes are exchanged, the offspring will be clones of the mother, but they are none the less in co-creation. The one in estrus receives what? A blessing, a promise of support, reason to begin the work of reproduction. A whiptail kept from her female mate, for they are mates without question, will hatch only a third as many young. A day later, even two, the bite marks remain visible on her skin. In college, I kept the articles in a folder on my laptop, PDFs labeled by scientific name, Lars argentatus, Thalassoma bifasciatum, a description of female co-parenting in owls as an abnormal and maladaptive behavior in captive raptors. An article by researchers who locked rams in a stanchion and presented them with male receivers and female sheep, killing rams who showed interest only in males to remove dud studs from the gene pool. The oldest article had been written in 1987, titled A Note on the Apparent Lowering of Moral Standards in the Lepidoptera. It described mature male Mazarine butterflies approaching and mating with male butterflies newly emerged from chrysalis, grasping the new male with their clasper and touching abdomen tip to abdomen tip before his wings were dry. I kept this list to myself. I knew some in my life would be offended by its homosexuality, others by its homophobia. I shared it with only one person, a woman, at the manatee health checks in Crystal River, Florida. She was working the nets, spent her hours waist-deep in muddy water, trapping manatees and beaching them. I was on the veterinary side, with the faculty advisor overseeing my undergrad thesis. I squatted in front of each manatee, counted their breaths. If the manatee went more than 45 seconds without a breath, I splashed their nose with a cup of water to trigger the surfacing response, watched the nostril muscles contract as the manatee sucked in air, a low roar. I had noticed her quick dry khaki shorts, the bunch of her shoulders, her competence with the nets. I told her about my list to impress her, told her seagulls exposed to DDT were more likely to wind up in lesbian pairs, that atrazine disrupted endocrine functioning in frogs, causing male frogs to look feminine and to take male partners. We were both on break. She was eating a stack of 3 granola bars in the shade of the canopy tent. She gave a little shrug. She said, "Manatees are gay." "Yeah," I said, though I hadn't known this. She said, "I'm gay. I realized, known this." "Me too," I said. "Whatever's in the water," she said, "we're getting it too." I nodded at her words, felt a heady sense of discovery, and with it a sense of belonging, a victimhood almost pleasurable. We'd both been poisoned to queerness. We lived in a toxic world. Tree swallow. One lays eggs. The other does not, but she broods the laid eggs. The eggs will not hatch. What matters is not the hatching. What matters is the warmth of the eggs, the graceful passing of those eggs, one parent to the other, the folding of her partner's bib of fat over those eggs, a slow unfurl, which sometimes, like now, causes her cloaca to tighten so that she mounts her partner as her partner broods the eggs, averting her cloaca to touch beneath her partner's lifted tail, both of them overcome. So this is an older essay, and I've thought a lot in the years since I wrote it about that same-sex tree swallow pair and how if we're limited to like Darwinian evolution, then those birds, unless they're somehow contributing in a way that we don't understand to the fertility of their cousins or their half-siblings or something, are basically victims of circumstance. They're confused, they're unfortunate. And what I love about art is that I can insist on the swallows being more than that, on them enjoying or even being aroused by their shared labor. And I think in the human realm, too, reproductive futurism is often uncomfortably central in our conversations about gender, and right now about gender-affirming care. So I'm going to read next a really short piece from my book, Manywhere. It's from a story called Bump, and it's about a trans woman who succeeds, to my mind, in moving towards her own desires around pregnancy, even as those run counter to the extremely limited definitions that I think we have currently in our society. Emma's telling me to slow down. Bump. To those who accuse me of immoderate desire, I say, look at the oil executives. Look at the gold rush. Look at all the women who want a ring and romance and lifelong commitment, and then look again at me. Me, I just want a person to dance the two-step with on Friday nights, a person who won't mind if I wear a shirt with maroon sequins or occasionally a strap-on pregnancy bump. In return, I offer a woman who can get by on little. I keep myself spotless. My car and my nails and my resume I polish. I polish myself. I polish myself until I shine. The first thing that drew me to Len was that anyone could tell this was a man who had worked to be where he was and would work to stay there. Born on a cattle ranch an hour outside Gainesville, he'd made partner at an Atlanta law firm, the firm that once represented Coca-Cola against the state. He wore a suit and tie to work even on casual Fridays. He had no Southern accent. On our first date, I asked him about the accent. He said I did away with it, like it was nothing, doing away with a whole part of yourself. When I talk about polish, this is what I mean. Representing Coca-Cola is reprehensible, of course, and I've told him that, but still I admire his dedication. When I told him on our third date I was trans, he said that makes no difference. Another reason I love him, not like my Nana, who had a conniption, said I was risking my job and my health and her livelihood in the bargain, since she lived with me and counted on me to provide for her. And I did lose that first job. I made mistakes. I worked a miserable job for 6 years just for the health insurance. But a year ago, I got a new part-time job, a better job, and here I am. Len didn't care I was trans. Now I think maybe I should have asked for more than ambivalence, but for 3 years I was happy with Len. Friday evenings we danced the two-step at Dig Down and he maneuvered me expertly through the crowd. He never trod on my foot, not once. Weekends he came over and cooked pasta. Sometimes when he was feeling ambitious he cooked crepes. He was devoted to me. His crepes were terrible. His wife, Melinda, sometimes invited me to the nail salon or for sushi. I was grateful to her for the invitations, though I always declined. We were cordial, Melinda and I. We understood how to fit together, how to help each other. We both believed it was a good thing, even a relieving thing, to divide up the responsibility of caring for a man. With Len, for the first time in my life, I could honestly say I am content. This all ended, of course. I can trace the descent to one moment 4 months ago when I was eating lunch with my coworker, Julie, and she asked me how I was feeling at the end of my first trimester. Now I had most certainly, most definitely not mentioned any baby or being pregnant or even wanting to be pregnant, which is something I continue to want quietly since it is impossible, and there is something inherently shameful in wanting concretely, not a whim, not a wish, but a cold, hard desire after an impossible thing. Uterine transplants are at least 6 years down the road. By then, I'll be past childbearing age. I know this, and I accept it, but there Julie was, acting as if I was carrying a baby, and there I was, to my great surprise, going along with it. I should have said I wasn't pregnant, whatever she'd heard, whatever rumor had been weaving itself together in the break room, but she smiled at me like we were sharing a new secret. She had been through 2 pregnancies, the second more difficult than the first. Everyone in the office knew the details. Her smile invited me to put my swollen feet up on conference tables, to send my ultrasounds to the all-office email. Right down into my abdomen, that smile warmed me. She thought I was pregnant, and so it seemed possible, and I smiled and said I feel better than ever, and that's how I'm in the mess I'm in now. I'm going to stop there on that story. And I have just one more excerpt, which is a bit longer. And this last piece is new work. It's also nonfiction. These are thoughts that I'm still working through. But I think about affirmations like the ones in the last two pieces, affirmations that are single in their focus and often crafted without access to queer or trans community as these sort of high wire acts, right? You can get somewhere by saying it's okay if I'm gay because seagulls are gay, but there's a natural limit to like how far that can actually take you. And so this last piece explores what happens when you reach that limit, or worse, if the tightrope is cut out from under you. This has been a really hard year for trans people in the US, and this essay is in part about the legislative and extrajudicial violence that trans and gender expansive folks face in this country right now. Given that there are notes of homophobia and transphobia, there's a description of hunting, there are mentions of violence against trans people, especially trans women of color, and there are mentions of suicide and suicidality. If that doesn't sound like it's for you right now, please feel free to step out. I promise I will take no offense. There's also joy, or I hope there is, and it's mostly about walruses. It's called The Walrus. In that season of mourning, that murderous season after Saya Woodland was shot in Maryland, and Maria Jose Rivera was shot in Houston, and Benko Brown was shot by a security guard in San Francisco, and Tortuguita was shot by police in Atlanta, and Ashley Burton was shot in her home in Atlanta, and Rashida Williams was shot on the street in Atlanta less than 2 months after being celebrated at the Sundance Festival. And as the bills came one after another from the governor's desks, and they silenced Zoe Zephyr for saying what anyone could see, that those legislators had blood on their hands, and after a friend of a friend was found naked in his closet, knife wound to the stomach, knife wound to the neck, a Tinder date turned nightmare, we said to the police, who ruled it a suicide, refused to investigate further, a choice we understood for the bullshit it was, because sure, some of us have considered suicide, but none of us has ever considered taking a knife to our stomach. In that season of mourning, I encountered, about a quarter mile down a narrow, icy spit, a walrus. Having hauled out of the water at high tide, he was beached, larval in the snow, one tusk curved and whole, the other broken, perhaps in a fight. And long after the group of artists I'd come with had walked on to the tip of the spit, on to the lighthouse, on to other icebergs, I stayed there with the walrus and one polar bear guard with a gun, who stayed only because she knew without my saying it that I needed to stay. I sat as the walrus belched, groaned deep in the throat, lifted his head to point his tusks directly at me. He moved his hind flippers, which have 5 digits, like long, wrinkled feet. I was captivated, and perhaps this was because the walrus had appeared so unafraid of the group of artists, or perhaps it was because of the penis visible at his abdomen, which he stroked occasionally with one flipper, that easy, undaunted obscenity, or perhaps it was because last year a right-wing provocateur released a children's book featuring a boy who pretended to be first a dog, then a crustacean, then finally a walrus, his mother and the internet and his doctor taking this last pretending seriously, suggesting gray makeup and surgery to turn his feet into fins, a lazy, forced analog for transness, which Amazon legitimized by categorizing the book as LGBTQ, where it briefly topped the chart. I'd learned about the book after a trans blogger on YouTube released a video responding to it. She made fun of the author's academic diction and his evident discomfort reading his book aloud to kids. Watching her video, I felt the first stirrings of fear, and when I scrolled down into the comments where person after person insisted she'd convinced them to buy the book, the fear shifted to anger. Not at the book. I didn't care about the book. Children's books can be a form of art. This one wasn't. It rhymed phobic with heroic. It used the phrase mean internet. The book didn't matter. It was her video that made me angry. What I felt reading those comments, watching his response, which YouTube played right after, the algorithm working its quick sadism upon me, what I felt was a desire to say to her, don't you see, this is exactly the game he wants you to play. When I said all of this to the polar bear guard, an outpouring she hadn't asked for but received with aplomb, she talked about the importance of hatred, how it was something you needed to feel sometimes. It wasn't the advice that surprised me, but that word, hatred. I hadn't considered that I hated the author of that book. Hatred was what he held for me, what made him write a book about walruses, go on talk shows trying to prove trans people don't know what a woman is. And in order to refuse his hatred any additional fodder, I will not insist the walrus was trans, though it's true that our group of artists struggled to gender him. The artist used it to refer to the walrus until they knew his gender, as though his gender was required to transport him from objecthood to beinghood. Most of the walrus's characteristics appeared masculine to me, the tusks, and especially the broken tusk, that marker of violence like an eye patch or a long scar, and he had several of those too, relics of summers lived in a herd where tusk threats often escalated to charges and strikes, punctured skin. Masculine, too, the bushy whiskers, the animal origin of the phrase a walrus mustache, and his size, that sheer largesse. He weighed, according to the guard, more than a ton. But of course, a female walrus has all of these qualities as well, only she is a little smaller, her tusks a little straighter. The exception to the walrus's masculinity, in my all-too-human estimation, were his hind flippers, which, when extended, struck me as deeply femme, their delicate webbing like a mermaid tail, or the folding fan snapped open by queens before the show. He stretched them, clapped them together to form one tail, folded them closed and delicately touched his side, his back where two scars formed an X, gently fingered his rolls of fat. I won't even say that the walrus was queer, though Edward Miller in Walrus Ethology describes how male walruses at a summer colony in Alaska engage in nasal greetings with other males, rubbing the whiskered pads of their faces together, and show homosexual behavior such as mounting and pelvic thrusting. 1/3 of mating behaviors exist between male walruses. One walrus clasps another with his flippers, for example, and thrusts his pelvis and erect penis against the other male. Immature male walruses often shadow older male walruses as they sing their love ballads, those delicate aquatic arias, surfacing and diving in concert. Some male walruses never engage in heterosexual mating, continuing these homosexual courtships into adulthood. Others eventually mount females in the late winter breeding season, turning their amorous attention back to males come summer. The sexual habits of female walruses have not, that I've found, been described at all. No one on the ship mentioned walrus homosexuality. When my fellow artists and residents described interactions between male walruses, they described aggression mostly, anger, sometimes stupidity. One, as evidence of walrus stupidity, described that scene from our planet that made the rounds on the internet a few years ago, which shows one walrus after another falling from a 250-meter cliff, splashing onto the rocks below. In the clip, Attenborough's voiceover links this behavior to climate change. The documentary has since been criticized for aligning space and time in their cuts, juxtaposing cliffs on two different beaches, making cause and effect difficult to parse. Some say the filmmaker's drones or encroaching polar bears frightened the walruses over the cliff's edge. Nothing to do with climate change, these skeptics insist in the comments on YouTube. Large numbers of walruses were seen falling from the cliff since the 1930s. This just happens sometimes. Another writes, instead of focusing our collective lens on the idiotic animals that commit suicide, we should focus on the ones that thrive. And when I read that comment, when I realized how it might all come together, I decided not to draw any further conclusions. I could, I think, if I wrote carefully enough, play their game and win it, devise a watertight response to that children's book, mock its rhetoric so effectively, so completely that I'd offer the author no new ammunition, but I can't get anywhere I want to go writing that way. And to point out the parallels in rhetoric, to bring in here a comment on that other video about suicide rates increasing among trans youth in 2023, quote, 41% already do attempt suicide, so what's the difference? Risks strengthening their hateful parallels. So I'll leave the walrus there, alone on his spit. I'll offer here only the facts I learned from the guidebooks on that ship. that walruses can live for 40 years, can dive up to 250 meters, that they must rest between dives, hauling out onto ice floes which transport them passively into new feeding areas, that they eat clams, find them with those sensitive whiskers, dislodge them by jetting water from the mouth and suck them whole from their shells, that a pregnant walrus must eat nearly 8,000 clams daily to maintain weight, that she strokes her belly with her fore-flippers during contractions to self-soothe, that they smell like the sea, musky, a smell both digestive and vaginal, that their tusks have rings of dentin and outer bark, less like teeth than small trees, and that they grow continually as long as the walrus is alive, that they blow like whales when surfacing after a polar dive and may roll upon surfacing to work it in, that they can clap their flippers so fast they vaporize the water, creating sound, that they can leap. And this to finish, that their populations dropped to about 2,000 before they were protected in the mid-20th century because walruses too have been hunted for their thick hide which was used to make machine belts for their ivory tusks. Stephen Bennett, hunting walruses on an icy spit in 1605, wrote, "Some were killed with the first shot, and some would go into the sea with 5 or 6 shot. They are of such an incredible strength. When all our shot and powder was spent, we would blow their eyes out with a little pease shot, and then come on the blind side of them, and with our carpenter's axe cleave their heads. But for all we could do, of above 1,000, we killed but 15. Because walruses have skin so thick, bullets and hatchets sometimes glance off. This makes them very difficult to kill." That's all I have for you.